welcome and thank you so much for joining us. So we are onto our next panel to talk about when the media create the story, who gets marked a criminal and who gets to be a victim. And we are joined today by three phenomenal experts. I'm going to give very brief introductions because, as you both know, we're running behind. So folks should feel free to access their full bios on the conference website. But Danielle is a criminologist and also has a journalism background and a nationally recognized expert on the media's portrayal of the criminal system, and has also published extensively on the topic of missing white woman syndrome, and is joining us separately from the American Society of Criminology conference in San Francisco that's happening right now. And Kailey was the lead author and one of the lead researchers on an article called Whose Lives Matter? Race, Space, and the Devaluation of Homicide Victims in Minority Communities, co-authored with Forrest Stewart and another PhD student at the University of Chicago, and is now at the, correct me if I'm wrong, Chicago Crime Lab, working as a project director on qualitative research projects, among other current projects. And Brandon is independent journalist and has written a book co-authored as well about the gun trace task force in Baltimore called You Got a Monster. And correct?
I got a monster.
I got a monster. Thank you. I'm so sorry.
Sorry, I'm not trying to be.
No. I appreciate it. And so we're going to talk together about this question of when people get to be seen with mercy versus when people get kind of marked as based on criminality, and what kind of harm gets accounted for in public discourse. So I figured Danielle could start us off in talking about some of your research. It would be great to open the conversation to talk about this idea of missing white woman syndrome and kind of what we know about how this coverage seems to happen, how this reifies notions about victimhood, and how it relates to identity and notions of innocence and moral blameworthiness. Danielle, can you join us and jump off?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And how funny that Kailey and I are both at the American Society of Criminology right now. So first, I'll just define the missing white woman syndrome. So the missing white woman syndrome is a term that was coined by Gwen Ifill, where she talked about how the media will cover the disappearance of missing white women and girls every day. And I think the piece that gets lost sometimes is not just the overrepresentation of white victims, but also the underrepresentation of women and girls of color. So in my study with Dr. Hank Fridella, we actually looked to see, are we finding the missing white woman syndrome in US newspapers? So we looked at 4 years worth of stories across 11 different newspapers. We were specifically focused on white versus Black missing women and girls. And what we found was support for the missing white woman syndrome. We found that white missing women and girls received more initial coverage and they received more repeated coverage than the missing Black women and girls. And that piece about repeated coverage is really important because not everybody is consuming media all the time like I am. And so sometimes people miss stories, but when a story is repeated over and over and over again, it becomes much harder to miss it, right? So that repeated coverage piece is important. Over the last couple of years since the disappearance and death of Gabby Petito, I've been doing a lot of front-facing work talking about these issues. And a lot of times there's this focus on the number of stories, right? And I do think the quantity of stories, the number of stories is really important, but it's also the quality of the story or what is said in the story that matters. So completely separate from my missing white woman syndrome work, I actually did several studies with Dr. Pauline Brennan, where we looked at how white, Black, and Latina women and girl victims are portrayed. And what we found is that the stories about the white women and girls were much more sympathetic than the stories about the Latina and Black women and girl victims. Specifically, the Latina and Black women and girls, they were portrayed as risk takers or as bad women in some way. And I'm happy to answer questions if y'all have any. The other thing was, and I would love to hear Kailey's thoughts on this, the other thing we found was that the stories about the white women and girl victims often talked about their safe neighborhoods, basically implying that this is a safe place and crime should not be happening here. On the flip side, the stories about the Latina and Black women and girls, there was a focus on their unsafe neighborhoods, right? So, taking that a step further, crime is normal here. Crime is to be expected. And so I think that piece is really important. I know you mentioned as well the ideal victim stereotype. There's been a very long history here in the US of white women and girls being the ideal victim stereotype. So for those who don't know, the ideal victim is a person who, when they experience harm or they experience crime, they're believed to be innocent, blameless, and in need of our protection. So in other words, they are worthy of our collective attention and our collective resources. And what we find in my own work is that those women who do not conform to the ideal victim stereotype, they're often shown as being somehow responsible for their own victimization. You'll hear victim blaming statements like they were using alcohol or drugs, or what type of clothing they were wearing, or that they were dating somebody with a domestic violence history. So I'll end there, but I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to learn from the rest of the panel as well.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's really helpful framing and these are themes that have come up over the course of the day, of course, but to understand the way that the research bears out what we all kind of have a sense through osmosis to be true, right? That there is this prioritization that is very obvious in the data. It's really helpful. Kailey, your study was a kind of similar exercise, but with a different focus. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you all constructed the study, what the kind of methodology was behind it, and then some of the key findings. And in particular, I think one of the things that was so interesting to me in this study was the way that these pre-existing stereotypes of Black and also Hispanic residents as inherently criminal kind of prefigures how news organizations treat homicide victims. So I wonder if you could talk about those dynamics and the findings in your paper.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for having me today. I was really excited when I saw the focus of this panel and this conference. I think this work is really important. And Danielle, it was exciting hearing about your work. I think, as you noted, there are a lot of parallels between, our findings. So in this work, this paper that I published with my co-authors, Forrest Stewart and Shannon Morrissey, a few years ago, we really focused on disparities in news coverage of homicides. And we were interested in both how the victim's identity, as well as the composition of the neighborhood where they were killed, affected the type of news coverage they received. And similar to Danielle's point, one of the things that we really noticed as we were doing a search of the literature, right, looking at the field, is that often research in this area focuses really heavily on the amount of coverage, right? So what's like the number of news articles, or like how many words are, victims receiving in this coverage? And so we did look at that, but we also focused on what we call complex personhood, similar to Danielle's point about like how the victims are actually being portrayed in these stories. And so in terms of our methodology, we compiled a unique data set of all homicide victims in Chicago from the year 2016. And we linked information on the victim's identity with all of the news coverage on each of the victims. And then we also connected that with US Census level data on the composition of the neighborhoods where they were killed. And so by doing that, we were able to explore this topic using this kind of mixed methods approach, right? And so similar to Danielle's work, we also find that the identity of the victim matters, right? For how someone's death is being covered by the media. So white women and young children in Chicago receive the most extensive news coverage, but beyond that, right? Beyond just the number of articles, we really see from qualitative coding that they're also much more likely to be portrayed in these stories as multidimensional people whose lives matter. The way that we really saw this framed is like she was like a young superstar student at her high school, and she had such a bright future ahead of her. There was so much potential, and this was such a loss for her family, right? Like she was a daughter, she was a granddaughter, she was a sister. So really sort of anchoring the language and the portrayal of the victim in this very sort of humanizing tone. On the flip side, we actually didn't find as much, for like older victims or for Black or Hispanic victims, for male victims. We weren't finding that in these stories in Chicago, at least, that they were sort of intentionally being covered on the opposite spectrum, but rather there was a lot of neutral language being used, right? Like very basic information was included in these articles. The name, the age, the neighborhood. But there wasn't this sort of focused effort by the media to really dig into who is this as a person and how can we portray them in that way. And then Katy, to your point, in addition to looking at the identity of victims, we were really interested in understanding how where they are situated actually could matter for the type of coverage that they receive. And so what we found is I mentioned we did sort of this mixed methods approach, but we found that if you hold constant the identity of the victim, the racial makeup of the neighborhood where someone is killed actually shaped both the amount of coverage that they received, but also the tone of that reporting in a statistically significant way. And so in that way, right, it's also about the neighborhood beyond just the individual. And so like to Danielle's point, like what we argue is like by providing less coverage and less humanizing coverage of homicides that are occurring in predominantly Black or predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods, what happens is this is leading to the normalization, right, of violence in these communities where homicides are treated as unremarkable or unsurprising. And Katy, I think maybe we're going to get a little bit later into sort of how that can have larger effects, right, beyond just the individual victim level. So I'll stop there. But again, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah. And I think, part of what we're trying to do at this conference is bring in researchers, but also journalists and people working on the ground to try to think about how those kinds of tropes that get reified in the kind and quality and amount of coverage leads to or prevents certain kinds of policy interventions in those neighborhoods. So I think you're absolutely right, Kailey, that we do want to get to that set of questions. But before we do, I want to hear a little bit from Brandon. And in particular, thinking about, so far we've teed up the way that kind of coverage of typical kind of what we think of as crime, although we've been really problematizing that idea today to some extent of like, is crime news and what even constitutes crime in the first instance, right? But the way that coverage happens or doesn't happen, and I think part of what, Brandon, your work is thinking differently about, who is committing harm in a community and who are the targets of that harm in a community. So I wonder if you can kind of start us from that jumping off point, right, of thinking about when there are, and Cerise's work earlier that we talked about too, right, has the same kind of feature of when the people who are charged as a matter of public policy and with our public resources as being in a force of protection are actually the ones who are targeting the people who are being demonized in communities, right? People who are drug dealers or carrying illegal weapons. What does that look like in terms of thinking about this idea of who gets to be a victim and how? Yeah.
Sure. So really briefly, I wrote a book with my co-writer Baynard Woods that came out in 2020 called I Got a Monster. It's about the Gun Trace Task Force, which you've probably heard about to some extent, which is basically a small group, relatively small group of police detectives, plainclothes squads that were all focused on gun seizures, especially this sort of criminal justice pivot that started to happen, in which we decided that the drug war was finally officially bad. And so now that it's officially bad, we want to stop doing that as much. And the immediate pivot was more of a rhetorical focus, and some data bears out an actual focus on guns and gun seizures. Specifically with the task force, what they were really doing, which is really remarkable, how it ties to Cerise's work, is that the Gun Trace Task Force was robbing people nightly They were planting evidence, they were stealing drugs, they were dealing drugs. There was at least 3 different drug dealers they were operating with that were sending the drugs that they stole to different places. They're making a lot of money off of this, and at the same time, they were framed as the vanguard of a new kind of policing. Now, none of this is new to any of us, but it was kind of new in 2007. To kind of tie it all together, the Gun Recovery Unit, which is a DC version of this, was founded in the same year. And essentially what these guys were doing, the core of their job was going out at night, of course at night, also so they could get overtime. So their day started at 11, but their day didn't really start until 3, and then they'd work all night. And they'd jack people up all night, up to 50 stops a night for anything, furtive motions, something in your pocket, you have a backpack, all that stuff. And then what they were doing when they got guns was they would seize the guns. And then they would arrest that person. If that person had money or drugs, they'd probably steal all the money, and they'd probably steal most of the drugs. They might even take the gun, hold it in their trunk, and plant it on somebody. So that's like the core of what I was interested in, and that built up to this general interest in this topic, which is my focus of my work is primarily on the idea of gun possession and the problems with gun possession as a crime, in my opinion at all. The possession of a gun, an illegal gun, and we all know what prohibits people from having guns, and how this operates in this way that really vilifies the exact same populations that were vilified and still continue to be vilified by drugs and the drug war. So it's kind of a gun war is how I see it. And the biggest thing in terms of harm I want to kind of talk about is like, okay, just imagine, many of you don't even have to imagine, you've probably seen it, but imagine a corner, I'll say in West Baltimore where I do a lot of my work. And there's a bunch of people hanging out, and a couple people, maybe there's some guys doing hand-to-hands, maybe someone has a gun for one reason or another. The cops sort of roll up, pop their door, and then the door pops, everyone runs, right? The running creates a pretext to search them, and then they search these people, and they do this all night, every night. This is happening whether it's 3 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning. You start to think about all the harms, just like boom, 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 like disrupts businesses, disrupts people on the way to work or school, causes a lot of chaos, people just seeing this chaos. And this chaos is a trade-off that's very completely accepted. I can mostly speak on Baltimore. This trade-off is completely acceptable, that you roll up on anyone that might be suspicious, which especially majority Black Baltimore, that's young Black men almost entirely, or and then you use these pretexts to search them. If they don't have anything, you let them go, and they're probably not going to complain. It's just the game. If they do complain, it doesn't really matter because they're from West Baltimore. Their ideas and their testimonies are not taken seriously. And that's the central thing I want to kind of just talk about, is this idea that this gun war is operating in this way that massively disrupts this community. The bigger picture is that I'm kind of cribbing a lot of ideas that really help me better understand this from Cure Violence. Violence interruption is a really profound practice, and in Baltimore it's been around since at least kind of about the same time as the task force stuff actually happened, which is interesting. But that, you have this idea that like the Cure Violence concept of like violence is kind of like a disease or something that spreads. It's like a virus, right? And that can start from anything. So let's go back to my example of this corner. Let's say they arrest a guy and they throw him in the car and they send him around the corner and they go, "You got a gun? No. You know where you can find one? If you know where a gun is, we'll let you go." "Yeah, this guy over there has a gun." They go get that guy. This guy leaves. If this guy cooperates, he's marked as a cooperator. It's very clear. He was in the car for 15 minutes. Now he's walking down the street, or it seems clear. Maybe he just told those cops to fuck off for 15 minutes, but no one knows that. So that creates this violence, this keeps spreading. The idea that police are not part of this violence, literally, but also that they're not infected by this. Like, I'm playing fast and loose with the terms. I'm not smart enough to explain this stuff in the right way. But like,
No, you're
that,
doing
like
great.
basically that if violence is something that spreads and it's something that kind of infects our mind, I think we can all feel that, right? We all have moments where we get upset. One thing makes you more upset, makes you more upset. That's the same metaphor. When you pile on top of that, this massive incarceration system, especially in Baltimore, and one fact I always try to stress, especially because now Martin O'Malley, the former mayor of Baltimore, is being framed as some sort of like democratic hope. There's 3 things that happened in O'Malley that are like O'Malley's mission that are massively important to this. The first is that he pushed away any approaches to violence reduction that were not zero tolerance, broken windows. That's the first thing. The second thing was he massively increased the ability and the comfort with the courts accepting this influx of people, because now all these baddies are going to come in. It's going to happen, but it's going to be good. In 2003, the Baltimore City made 110 arrests. That's in a city of 615,000 people, which at that point, 66 to 68% of the people would have been black in Baltimore at that point. It's down to like 62 now. That's a remarkable amount of people. It's a remarkable stress on the system that the judges were all like, we're ready for it. This is the mission, you know? So I bring that up because that's already happening, and that was happening. And in some ways, the gun war was a reduction of that. We're not going to jack you up for trespassing or having an open container. I mean, they may, but not as much. We're focused on the bad guys with guns. So then you bring these cops in that were raised on this specific kind of policing, and then they're told to just go out there and get the guns by any means necessary. Don't worry about probable cause. Once they got a gun, no one gives a shit about what happened to them or how you got that gun, including if you planted on them. And so you have these cops that are sick with the same kind of violence that we're all infected by, but especially in communities that have been divested. And so the idea that you would kind of continue this half-assed metaphor I'm developing, you are sending sick people in a community that has the same ailment, and you're expecting these cops to be able to like regulate this or figure it out or act right in that system. It just makes no sense. And then the last thing in terms of victims is obviously the other game here that this squad and a squad I'm looking at now that are called the district action teams, which are doing the same thing the other guys were doing in Baltimore. And before that, it was a thing called SES, Special Enforcement Section. Before that, it had another name. I think we all know this sort of game where you just, a plainclothes squad does something bad and you change the name. And maybe you move one guy over to like do paperwork or something. But that at the center of that was this idea that these people were not people that would be trusted. And that also there was this double bind of the incarceration system too, that like if you get busted and they steal your drugs and you don't say, well, actually I had more drugs than I was arrested with. There would be no reason to do that. Why would you ever, no defense attorney would encourage you to do that. I would not encourage you to do that. What became so remarkable about this story, I probably feel like I'm talking too long.
No, it's okay.
What's became so remarkable about the story is that once these guys were federally indicted, and how that all happened is complex. We can get into that maybe later, not at all. But like once these officers were indicted, they were framed as a criminal enterprise within the Baltimore Police Department. And so that complicated these things in a way that was useful for the kind of stuff I've been reporting on and kind of talking about or yelling about at parties, because now it's the federal government, the DOJ is saying the cops are a gang. That's interesting, because it's not just me saying, it's not just some lefty guy like me saying it anymore, it's the DOJ. And then what happened out of that was they had to start having people come and testify and be subpoenaed, grand juried. And so you had this remarkable situation where the cops were the perpetrators, the people who deal drugs or allegedly deal drugs or dealt drugs 20 years ago and don't anymore, but are still suspicious because they're living a life and therefore they're automatically suspicious of still dealing drugs. Those people were seen as the victims in this very narrow space. I want to say, like, this is not a defense of the DOJ and its approach or anything, but in this case, that you had drug dealers, people who deal drugs, which is just a job. That's also essential to my work. Like, dealing drugs is just a job. That's all it is. And you see all the same things you see in every other job, except for what many people already talked about, which is that you can't go to the police to regulate your job because it's against the law. So what happens is you start to have people who deal drugs that have to testify, yes, I had with immunity, yes, I had drugs, and they were stolen. Yes, I had $250,000 in a safe and it was all taken, or $250,000 in a safe and they only reported $75,000. This is a true story. Kind of if the documentary in my book, the arc of the book is a guy who had almost $200,000 stolen from him and 3 kilograms of cocaine. So he had to testify against it. He didn't want to. He still saw it as snitching, which I understand, but he had to go up there, he subpoenaed and say, this is what happened to me. So I just thought that was a remarkable, like, kind of test case that we've been talking a lot about, like, how do we frame these things and how do we make them explicable to like people that maybe aren't exactly the kind of people that come to this. I felt this was a very useful test case in that, because I kind of had the DOJ on my side. I kind of had these other people. But it really it was so remarkable to finally, in Baltimore City, I've lived in almost my entire life, to have the Department of Justice in this very narrow case say what Baltimoreans have been telling me for a very long time, which is the cops are a gang, they plant shit, they steal shit, they're selling drugs. And there was a moment where this happened that me and my partner, my co-writer, seized to write the book. And before that, we had been doing some other research. The other thing I'll say is that for us, it began with hearing people telling us to check this shit out back in like 2013, 2014. These officers were indicted in 2017. Hey, you know, they came to my mixtape spot, they blew up the safe, they took all the cash out of the safe. I'd be like, can I see that safe? Sometimes they'd be like, I got a little video of it. You can't show it to anybody else, but I'll show it to you. So we were already hearing these stories, and we had like little snippets of it. And what happened was the DOJ and this indictment, this federal indictment, benefited, I think, our rhetorical ends. And also it was such a complex story that it enabled a book and some other stuff like that. But basically, the public defender's office in Baltimore calculated that as many as like almost 30,000 cases are really tainted by these guys, which is basically 7 to 12 plainclothes cops over a span of 20 years. Only about 2,000 really got any sort of even remote justice. They got out. But it's just these concentric circles of corruption that were based on knowing that this kind of person, especially a young black man in Baltimore that is suspected of dealing drugs simply because he's young and black in Baltimore, is not even worthy of being considered a victim ever, and anything that happened to them was justifiable because they're bad. That's kind of sorry, it's a little long. That's the simplest way to put it.
I appreciate that, and I think, look, there's so much richness in that one story, and I think part of the takeaway for me, right, is that it is so rare for that kind of policing to be so flagrant that it gets investigated by the Department of Justice, right? But it is not so rare for that kind of, for policing to happen that takes liberties, let's say, with where the lines are, and even in the way that people get kind of feel coerced to become informants, right? And who becomes the informants, and then what do those structures look like? So that that's how the law functions, right? That's prosecutions in many kinds of communities do not exist without there being confidential informants. That is how so many drug cases happen still, even though you're right that the war on drugs is sort of in our rhetoric out of favor, even if in reality.
Yeah, I don't want to downplay it. I'm just like making the point that the gun thing is a relatively new innovation.
Absolutely right, and I think part of where I want to steer us to, and come back to Danielle and Kailey to kind of reune in our conversation, is to say, thinking about the way that these patterns exist along a spectrum, right, and then also kind of what it tells us about thinking about these communities more holistically. So, I think many people who are we've been having a conversation all day about the kinds of crimes of violence that get weaponized in media, right, and thought about as the things that make people really afraid. But there are, that kind of violence is experienced disproportionately in certain communities, right? And in those communities also is where we have the most saturation of policing and prosecution and incarceration, right? In our most impoverished, under-resourced communities, that's also where these stories that Danielle and Kailey's research where that missingness is happening too, right? In terms of the missingness of the stories of Indigenous women and Black women and Hispanic women, and also young Black and brown men who are killed by gun violence, right? All of that is concentrated. All of this is concentrated in these one community, one sets of communities. And so I wonder if we could talk about that, about why and how the media don't create that kind of nuance in thinking about where harm is happening, and also who are experiencing the burdens of that harm, and how that limits the horizons in terms of not only what kinds of policy interventions we can even consider, but also what victims' rights movements look like in this country, right? We talked earlier about the way that prosecutors will stand up and do kind of legislative organizing in trying to shape public policy around using certain stories of victims, but that leaves out this complexity that is actually the reality of what's happening on the ground. So I'll start with you, Danielle, and then we'll move to Kailey to kind of lead us off on that. I know that was a lot of questions all at once, so take what you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I wanted to mention is a little bit, and forgive me, I have not seen the other panelists today. So I just wanted to mention about the profit-making enterprise that is the missing white woman syndrome, right? We know that in the US, mainstream media outlets get a lot of their profit from advertising revenue. And we know that historically, these stories about white missing women and girls have received an enormous amount of attention. You see lots of people engaging with these stories, sharing them, and listening to them. And for that reason, I think we are likely to continue to see this reporting because there is such a strong link between these stories and the clicks and likes and shares that bring the advertising revenue. So I just wanted to mention that. I am not sure if that's been covered today.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right to mention it, and it is a theme we've come back to, but I really appreciate you bringing it out here.
Yeah, and then I'll speak to the policy piece. So there's a very famous quote from an author or a scholar named Kristen Gilchrist, where she said that, quote, good women are seen as worth saving and avenging, right? And I've thought about this so much in my own work because so much of my work has found that women and girls of color are portrayed much less favorably and, victim blaming, right? And so I think it's important to point out, how does this play out in real life? So I think all of us on this panel believe that media matters and that the media matters to our understanding of crime and victimization. And so if we buy into this notion that the media matters, I think that we can go a step further and say that this affects police, this affects prosecutors, this affects jurors and how they respond to criminal events. And in fact, there is quite a bit of evidence that not all victims receive the same degree of justice. And I think differential media coverage is just one piece of that. And so I'll give some examples. So first, research shows that police work harder to solve a case once it has received media attention, right? It puts pressure on police to solve this quickly. Regarding criminal sentencing, brief content warning, I'm going to mention sexual assault. We know that research shows that people who sexually assault white women tend to get longer sentences than those who assault women of color, and specifically Black women. We also know, if you look at the death penalty, that if the victim is a white woman or girl, you're more likely to see the death penalty as the outcome. And then I love this study. I come back to it a lot in my work. There's a study called Where is Letitia's Law, right? And what they looked at was 51 laws here in the US that have been named after victims. And what they found is that 86% of those named laws are honoring white victims here in the US. So I think that the media is so important to our understanding of who is a, quote, ideal victim or who is a, quote, true victim. So I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to hearing what the rest of the panel thinks too.
Thank you for that. Kailey, do you want to pick up there? I think in particular, in thinking about kind of like, what does the limited scope of this kind of coverage mean for what kinds of policy interventions are even on the table to be considered?
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and thanks, Danielle. So I want to start by building off of one of the points that Danielle made, which is that like the media matters, right? This affects police. So in some of my more recent research in Chicago, with the different research team, we did in-depth interviews with Chicago Police Department, homicide detectives, aggravated battery detectives. So these detectives who are working on violent crime cases. And we spoke with them about many different things, but one of the things that came up in these conversations and that we were interested about is like the investigations and sort of how detectives, but also like higher ups, are thinking about like prioritization of different types of cases, right? And so we didn't even ask them explicitly about the media, but we were just asking them, like, walk us through the course of your investigation. Like, tell us about a recent, homicide investigation. Like, how did you decide, the resources that could go into it? Like, how was this determined? And consistently, like one of the key themes that we found is that media coverage actually directly impacted like how they and their department are prioritizing these types of cases, right? And so it's often not detectives themselves saying like, I see this case is getting a lot of coverage. It's coming from much higher up, right? But it's being relayed to them, like, you know, like the media is asking by their higher ups, the media is asking me about this case and I'm going to be hounded about it. Like, we need to see some results here. And so detectives on the ground are hearing that message and they're taking that into account in terms of thinking through like which cases to prioritize, right, with the limited resources, you know, that they have. So I wanted to start there. And I think one of the other points I wanted to bring up is that, you know, like beyond the ways that this affects policing or policies, this affects community members, right? And so in another sort of separate study recently, I partnered with a nonprofit in Chicago, and we spoke with community members who are living in neighborhoods across the city that experience disproportionately high levels of gun violence. And we found that community members themselves are explicitly saying, right, and other research has shown this for decades, right? Community members are saying, like, my especially, so actually this is with specifically community members who had lost a loved one to gun violence. And what we're hearing from them is, my case was not treated as important. The loss of my loved one was not seen as noteworthy or important, not just by the news media, right? But like just in general, like they're sort of, this is sinking into them, and it's the message is coming across that like we are not valued and our loved ones are not valued. And so I think that's another important piece to this, right, is beyond just the effects on policy and you know, like police or other sort of state level actors, community members are sort of not blind to the fact that this is happening, and it plays a toll, right? Even as they're sort of experiencing loss of loved ones from gun violence, it's sort of another added layer of trauma that they're then having to experience.
I think that's really helpful and also useful in thinking about how that relates to the structure of what happens when someone loses their life to violence, right? What is offered to families, right, is then prosecution of the person, like finding the person who did it and then prosecution of that person. And that doesn't actually necessarily meet what someone's needs are in the aftermath of losing a loved one, right? And so part of what I think this kind of missingness in the way that these stories get covered is it reifies that the one option that people have to receive is prosecution and an investment then in many places in extremely long sentences, right, for people who may or may not actually ultimately change over time in important ways, as we talked about on the earlier panel, right, in Nosgold's research about what extreme sentencing looks like, and the way that you know, people who were serving even sentences for homicides may be able to totally transform their lives after a period of time. And so what is it, I think part of what I'm getting at is, to the extent that this media coverage, by reinvesting in when there is harm and violence, the one thing that happens is policing and prosecution and incarceration, leaves out the full complexity of people's lives, and also then how to meet their needs in important ways and prevent this kind of harm from recurring, right? Whether that's specifically preventing retaliatory crimes in response to the loss of life, or more holistically thinking about how does a person heal and how does a community heal when someone who is beloved by people in the community is lost to that community. So in that way, you know, to kind of round things out, and then we're going to pause for questions from the audience, I figured, Brandon, if you want to respond also to that question of thinking about what this does in terms of thinking, limiting our horizons, our imagination around public policy.
Yeah, so a lot of the like especially the critiques of the media today, I think are completely spot on, and I'm glad that they're happening. I'll kind of start here, which is like, you know, one thing that's important to say is like the kind of the type of victim that I report on there isn't sort of the white woman syndrome in that way. I just want to separate that from what y'all do. They're just different parts of the same thing. That's to say there aren't people are generally probably nicer to white drug dealers, but they don't really, white drug dealers don't have they're not on the news and being praised. But I only bring that up to say there's a difference here. I don't want to suggest that what I'm doing is the same. I think it's very important. We all need to kind of attack this from different ways, right? But specifically where the kind of victims that I'm speaking of matter is because what gets leveraged against them, particularly policy-wise, and in Baltimore is public safety, of course, and specifically the murder rate, which Baltimore has a very high murder rate and has for the most part for the past 30 years. And my thing with the media is like, homicides can't be the most important issue in the city, which they kind of are. And I hear this all the time. They can't be the most important thing and the thing that gets the most like cursory, underdeveloped coverage. It doesn't make any sense. But that's all that happens. And then it relates to the clip that we started the whole day with, which is, I'm gonna misquote, but like, he basically said something that I always say, which is reporters are a lot like cops. You give them a directive, they'll focus on that directive. Same way, if you cover fires, you'll find the fires, like the dude said today. You know, I had a former police commissioner of Baltimore told me this candidly. I won't reveal who it was, I'll say it. He was like, look, Brandon, if I told all the cops out there to get people with purple shoes, they'd find 100 people with purple shoes tomorrow. So there's no difference in the strategy, the focus. It's entirely where the police direct that. And that's where the media, and that's where this kind of increasingly like complex game of tension that's going on. And then the other thing about this with the media and policy is that the community's idea of policing, and I'm talking about people that are definitely like suffering in a way as a white person, and where I live in the city, I don't suffer from at all. Their idea of policing and the police's idea of policing, even the media's idea of policing, are rapidly different. When you speak to someone in a community that's been heavily affected by this and the divestment that leads to crime and more homicides in these areas, and they're like, well, I would like to walk to the store and not be afraid someone's gonna hit me in the head with a pipe. Fair enough, that's where it starts, right? And then the cops say, yeah, we agree. That's why we've started a 82-person plainclothes specialized unit that patrols the city from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., peak crime hours in high crime areas. And that's why we need to jack up every person we see on the street, throw them against the wall, embarrass them. And then it's like the community might, like, whether they say this literally or not, and in some ways they're just like, well, I'm just happy they responded, because when I call the police, usually, okay, sure, if they want to send a bunch of jump out boys to my community, I'll accept it, because I have no other options. There's no other option. But it's like, no one's asking for that. That's not what anyone's conception of even violence reduction is from even if you're like super carceral. Unless you're like a maniac, this is not what you think policing is. It's not. This idea, you know, so that's, and then media is sort of framed in this because what they do is these things are couched as like technocratic fixes, right? So then the media will write something like, I'm mainly speaking on Baltimore here, that's like really innovative approach from Baltimore, this new violence reduction strategy, they have cops on dots, I'm sure you've heard of all this stuff. It's all the same thing over and over again. And I'm only so direct about this because I'm just like, it doesn't work and it's fake. I'm just like, it's fake. It's not real. It doesn't reduce violence. It just increases harm. But this is central to it. And then the last thing I'll say is with this is like, the work I do is not hard or complicated at all. I talk to people, I pull documents, and I go to the scenes of crimes. And then I talked to, did you see anything when this happened? I know it was a year ago, but do you remember? And often you'll remember these because they're, even if they see them free, they're terrifying. I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever been part of or ever seen or witnessed like a sort of police raid or just like these jump outs, like these like pop the door, run up on people. It's really upsetting. It causes harm. It's traumatic in and of itself. So all I do is do those three things. There is nothing stopping any reporter in Baltimore from calling someone who's had this happen to them, walking to the courthouse and pulling the incident report and talking to the police or getting the police statements and just trying to triangulate those three things. That's mostly what I do. It's not super sophisticated or complicated. Anyone could do this. They just don't well, I don't know why they don't. But I just think that's really important to think about. This is not hard stuff. And like what I've gotten to the point with this is that if someone reaches out to me and is like, hey, I had this bad incident with the police, kind of question that was come up with some people who are in the legal community today was like, how can reporters, is like, my primary sources are defense attorneys. That's very explicit. And they will just give me documents, and like there's agreements and there's ways I work this, but I get people at this point call me and say, hey, I got a guy for you. Or people reach out to me and say, my husband got this happened to them. So that's where these stories start. The other thing from my reporting, which I hope that may be a useful model somehow, is like, I start with the incident and the victim and what happened to them. The policy and the other stuff is really, really important. And like the data, evidence-based data, all that stuff is massively important. But all I start with was like, this happened to someone, I'm gonna start trying to write about it and talk to them. This takes a really long time. It can take 6 or 8 months to do these 3,000 word stories. It's kind of not a great use of time if you really calculated it. But what I'm just trying to say is that there are ways to do this, especially now, and that people don't is part of the problem. And that there's a lot of this sort of constant loop we've been talking about, police and media and how they keep pulling each other around. There are ways to just step out of that. And I just would encourage more reporters and more media people to do that.
Thank you. So we, have no time as usual, but I would like to take a few questions from the audience. If folks have questions, Brian's got a microphone that he can pass around. Does anyone have any questions for our panel? Yeah, I've got Ivy and then here. Please speak into the mic because that's the only way it'll end up on the recording.
I guess my question, I think you touched on it before, is how do we pay people for their time? Because not only just you and not only attorneys, because if a case gets dismissed, I mean, there's no public funding for that person to get anything from the fact they've been in custody for years and their family has lost everything and all of that. But when families who have been victimized, when victims want to come out and speak out, how do we pay them for their time? How do we make sure your sources get compensated so that we're not just exploiting communities in trying to solve a problem that is already exploiting them?
Yeah, right. So for me, I guess, was the question is it okay if all right, I'll answer first then, sorry. So I think I don't pay sources. It doesn't, for me, work that way. I'm not dismissing your question. I'm gonna add, there's an and here. Like, that just doesn't work. But when I'm doing early reporting, if I talk to someone, I want to learn something, or I do a lot of reporting on drug users and drug dealers and things like that. If I would try to pay people, especially if they don't have any money, I pay them for their time early on. But in terms of like if you're a source, but the one thing I can do that I try my best to do is provide them with resources. I think that to some extent, the reporting I do does legitimize their concerns, and I'm glad to point them in different directions. I do think that there should be more sort of victim compensation. And there was a conversation after the Gun Trace Task Force in Baltimore to develop this. It quickly unraveled because it was 2017. We were already clawing back this reforms and stuff like that. So I can say that for my work, I don't want to pay people. I refuse to pay people in that way. But what I can do is be direct and honest with people and expectations and work with them on their terms. That's why these stories take a long time for me, is because I want to make sure everyone's comfortable and okay, and never want to run a story that everyone needs to know what to expect. This includes people I speak to in prison, things like that. Even if there's a case I did about a guy who kind of a remarkable Second Amendment claim by someone who has illegal guns seized, and he basically argued he has a right to the Second Amendment. It went to the Maryland Supreme Court, obviously. They were like, but he was in prison, and so even with him, where I could have had the reporter thing of being like, well, it's public documents, I don't need to ask you, but like I wanted to talk to the guy and I wanted to see. But so I don't have an answer to your question, but what I want to say is like, I can't compensate people for their time. I barely get compensated for my time with this stuff, to be honest. But that's different too. But just my main thing is like, there are ways that we can work. And if you develop this trust and there's this engagement and it's not this sort of in and out thing, hey, someone got shot on this block, you saw it, let me talk to you. If it's sort of a relationship building, it takes time. There's at least a rapport and a comfort and a development between me and this person that I don't want to dismiss. It has nothing, it's not a bigger thing. I'm not saying these people are my buddies and I understand it fully, but I try to come to an agreement. And part of that agreement is often like, when this story comes out, some people won't like it. When this story comes out, some people are gonna look at your husband's record and they're gonna put it in the comments, and I'll talk to you about that. And some of that at least moves people to be more comfortable. And they also recognize that there just no one is ever thinking, even if you're completely internet poisoned like me, you don't think about these things in that way. So that's one way, but I think that there should be victim compensations funds for this kind of stuff. And I think that reporters should be more open to seeing sources as not people that you just extract things from over a day or a year or 5 years or whatever. There needs to be just more give and take, and it's going to mostly require reporters to be more humble and recognize how little they know than they are currently.
Danielle or Kailey, did you have anything to add on that question? Okay. We've got maybe, yeah, we had one or two more, and then we will have to wrap up.
Thank you for your presentations. I'm thinking about what was said about how police work harder to solve cases when there's media pressure. I'm thinking about kind of data statistics of kind of just police closing cases and then the pressure is gone, but that doesn't actually mean that much because the case still has to be proved and things like that. I would kind of contend that a lot of these case closures are just police, picking up random people that are not actually responsible for the crime just to get the pressure off their back. And how does that fit into this, media narrative of, I'm not a huge fan of this phrase, but like justice being served for victims, particularly if it is kind of these white victims that get so much pressure, but the police kind of aren't, quote unquote, doing their jobs.
Yeah, Danielle or Kailey, would one of you like to jump off on that?
I think it's a great question. And I do think, this is something I have not done research on specifically, but I do think there is that question of, okay, if the media puts pressure on law enforcement, that doesn't necessarily mean that law enforcement is going to get it right. And I think that's the crux of your question. And so I would love to know more about that. And, I agree with you. There's pressure to close cases just in general, right? But when I think the thing that I come back to a lot, especially for missing persons cases, is that we see that when a person goes missing, especially a person of color, they're much more likely to be portrayed as a quote runaway for those early days of that person's missing status. And that basically takes the pressure off, right? Oh, this person walked away and they're going to come back. Even if it gets fixed a few days later and they're termed at risk, those first 3 days are vitally important to solving a case correctly, right? And so I think that I go to that a lot when I think about this, is just that media pressure definitely matters, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be correct. And I think when cases get really, really big, I think that there's obviously a concern, right, that the wrong person may be picked up. So I haven't done the research, but I think it's a fantastic question. I would love to hear what the police think about that. So yeah, I appreciate the question very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good question. I similarly have not done research on this exact topic, but one of the things in this sort of in-depth interview study that I did with Chicago Police Department that did come up is some sort of tension where, like, when the police detectives and the police department feel a lot of pressure to solve a case in Chicago, which is its own unique like political environment, right? One of the constraints that they come up against, even if from their perspective, there's a lot of evidence, is actually the state's attorney's office. And this looks different in every city, right? But in Chicago, anyways, like one of the things that detectives are telling us pretty honestly is like, I feel like there's enough evidence in this case. Like, I know who did it, but like, I'm not going to make an arrest because I know that the state's attorney's office, they're not going to agree to file charges. They want this type of evidence. They want this type of evidence. They want this other type of evidence. Like, there's no point in me making this arrest if nothing's going to come out of it. So I'm not saying like the state's attorney's offices are, sort of the solution here, but at least from what we're hearing in these interviews, it wasn't that straightforward in Chicago, at least in terms of how detectives are thinking about like the ease of sort of making an arrest or making a case, even in cases where like they personally felt like they had quite a lot of evidence. So it's not a full answer, but I do think it's a good question.
I'd just offer one more response to that, which is that I think someone could do research on that actually pretty readily, given the existing data set from the National Registry of Exonerations, right? That registry exists, and there have been really interesting kind of legal academic studies coming out of that registry to look at what are the chief causes of wrongful convictions, in particular for very serious offenses that, like rape, sexual assault, and homicide charges, right? That's the primarily set of offenses that are on that registry. And that prosecutorial and police misconduct are some of the leading causes of wrongful convictions. And that I think relates, I mean, anecdotally, Boston has had a number of exonerations within the last couple of years in particular. And I think those exonerees are primarily people who were covered dramatically with media attention at the time of those offenses, right? So the ANIC data, I think, would support the inference, but there is an available data set if someone's interested in doing that research. And on that note, I think, unfortunately, we have to wrap up because we're bleeding into the next set of our final panel of the day. But I just want to thank you all so much for being here remotely and in person. And yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.